The coach rocked one last time, a weary sigh of wood and leather, before settling into the silence of Juniper Ford. When the door swung open, it let in a gust of wind thick with red dust and the scent of something dry and spicy, like herbs left too long in the sun. Mara Lynn gathered her skirts, holding her bonnet against the breeze, and stepped down onto the hard-packed earth. The dust, fine as flour, immediately settled on the hem of her dark blue traveling dress. For a moment, the town seemed to hold its breath. Faces turned from the mercantile porch, from the wide door of the smithy, from the shade of the livery stable. They were not unkind faces, but they were deeply curious, their gazes as steady and searching as the sun. A woman alone, with a bookish tilt to her head and hands that looked too soft for this country, was a thing to be measured. Mara felt their eyes on her and straightened her spine, a small act of defiance against the overwhelming sense of being an outsider. This was it, Juniper Ford, the end of a long, rattling journey and the beginning of a life she could only guess at. Across the street, Elias Thorne loaded a heavy sack of salt into the back of his wagon. He'd timed his trip to be as brief as possible. Get in, get the salt and flour, and get out before the town's weekly market swelled into a proper crowd. He worked with a quiet economy of motion, his body accustomed to the rhythms of solitary labor. He did not like towns. They were loud with things unsaid, cluttered with people who stood too close and asked questions with their eyes. His ranch on Dry Cedar Ridge was his sanctuary, a place where the only sounds were the wind whistling through sparse cedars and the lowing of his cattle. That was a language he understood. The wind shifted, carrying the sharp scent of sagebrush from the hills and, fainter, the slow, methodical tolling of the church bell. It was a sound that seemed to measure time differently out here, each ring a heavy drop into a deep well of silence. The market was a low hum of activity, a farmer haggling over the price of chickens, the clink of glass bottles at the mercantile, the murmur of gossip that traveled faster than a horse. It was, as the townsfolk liked to say, just loud enough. Mara clutched her small valise, the only luggage she'd kept with her on the coach. The rest would be delivered to the boarding house later. She scanned the dusty street, a simple collection of weathered wooden buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the vast, indifferent landscape of the Blue Lantern Range. There was the mercantile, the saloon with its swinging doors and a painted sign proclaiming it the Nickel Star, the smithy, and a squat stone building that had to be the bank. She was looking for something smaller, more humble. She needed to find the schoolhouse, to see the place where her new life would take root. She saw a man leaning against a hitching post, whittling a piece of wood, and decided he looked approachable enough. "Excuse me," she began, her voice feeling small in the open air. "Could you direct me to the schoolhouse?" The man looked up, squinted, then pointed with his knife. "Down that way, ma'am. Can't miss it. Past the church." Mara thanked him and set off, her boots sinking slightly into the deep dust. She walked past the white-steepled church, its paint peeling in the sun, but saw nothing that looked like a school. There was only the parsonage, a small cemetery with crooked headstones, and then the road dissolving into open country. A flicker of frustration, of feeling utterly adrift, passed through her. Elias saw it happen. He'd seen the schoolteacher arrive, another hopeful soul carted in by the stagecoach, likely to be carted out again by the first winter snow or a wave of loneliness. He'd heard her ask old Jeb for directions and saw the lazy, careless way Jeb had pointed. He knew where Jeb was sending her to the old schoolhouse site, the one that had burned down 2 years ago. The new one was at the other end of town. It wasn't his business. He had his salt. His horse was hitched. Home was waiting. He untied the reins, his hand resting on the warm leather. He told himself to get in the wagon and go, but then he saw her stop, a lone figure at the edge of town, looking back with an expression of quiet confusion. It was the set of her shoulders, a subtle slump of disappointment. That did it. With a low curse muttered to his horse, Elias tied the reins again and started across the street, his long-legged stride eating up the distance. His boots made soft, rhythmic thuds in the dust. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Mara turned, startled. The man standing before her was tall, built of little more than lean muscle and bone, with a face tanned to the color of worn saddle leather by years of sun and wind. His eyes, a startlingly pale gray, were framed by sun crinkles, and they seemed to take in everything at once. He held his hat in his hands, a gesture of respect that sat oddly with the raw, untamed look of him. "He sent you the wrong way," Elias stated, not unkindly. He nodded back toward the center of town. "The new schoolhouse is yonder, past the livery." Mara felt a blush creep up her neck, a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. "Oh, I see. Thank you." "Jeb probably ain't noticed they rebuilt it," Elias added. A dry attempt at smoothing over the moment. He felt clumsy, out of his element. He was used to dealing with cattle and fences, things that didn't look back at you with large, intelligent brown eyes. "Well, I'm grateful you did," Mara said. And then she smiled. It wasn't a large smile, just a slight, genuine curve of her lips. But it transformed her face, softening the weary lines of travel and letting a light shine through. For a half-second, their eyes met and held. In that instant, Elias saw the resilience beneath her refined exterior, and she saw a deep, settled loneliness in him, something that went far beyond mere solitude. A current passed between them, unexpected and unnameable. Then, as if by a shared, unspoken agreement, they both looked away. Mara looked down at her dusty boots. Elias looked up at the sharp line of the mountains on the horizon. The moment was gone, leaving a strange hum in the air between them. "Thank you, Mr.—" Mara prompted softly. "Thorne. Elias Thorne." He put his hat back on, settling it low on his brow as if to shield himself. "Ma'am." He gave a curt nod, turned, and walked back to his wagon without another word, the interaction having already cost him more social energy than he'd planned to spend all month. As he drove the wagon out of town, he passed the Nickel Star Saloon. The doors swung open as a man stumbled out, and, for a moment, the dim, smoky interior was visible. Elias caught a fragment of conversation, a low, gravelly voice laced with worry. "Hollow Spur Gang. Heard they hit the stage near Willow Creek." The name hung in the air like a bad smell. Elias's hands tightened on the reins. Trouble on the roads was nothing new, but the Hollow Spur boys were a different breed, meaner, more desperate. He pushed the thought away. It was not his concern. His world was bounded by the fences of Dry Cedar Ridge. Mara found the Pelican House, a 2-story establishment that served as the town's only hotel and boarding house. The proprietor, a stout woman named Mrs. Gable with a permanently skeptical expression, gave Mara a key to a room on the 2nd floor. The room was small and spare, containing a narrow iron bed, a washstand with a chipped porcelain basin, and a single window that overlooked a dusty back alley. The walls were little more than thin planks of wood, and through them, she could hear everything: a man in the next room coughing, the ceaseless, cheerful plinking of a banjo from the saloon downstairs, the low murmur of voices. It wasn't the peaceful quiet she had imagined, but it was a place to lay her head. She sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, the sounds of Juniper Ford pressing in on her, and felt a profound and aching loneliness settle over her like a shroud. Back in town, Elias made one last stop. He'd forgotten thread for mending his canvas coat. As he tied his horse outside the mercantile, his eyes fell on a notice board nailed to the porch post. Among the flyers for wanted men and announcements of a town social was a handwritten sign: "Saddle for sale, good leather, see Hank at livery." He didn't need a saddle. The one he had was old but sound, molded to him and his horse. Yet he found himself walking toward the livery, drawn by an impulse he didn't bother to name. Hank, the livery owner, pointed to the saddle in question. It was thrown over a wooden sawhorse in a dusty corner, abandoned and forgotten. Elias ran his hand over the seat. The leather was old, deeply cracked in places, but still supple. His thumb traced a long, deep gouge near the cantle, a scar left by something sharp. He closed his eyes for a second, and the smell of old leather and horse sweat filled his head, bringing with it the phantom sting of a rope burn across his own wrist, the memory of a fall, of fear so sharp it tasted like blood in his mouth. He felt the pull of a past he had ridden hard to escape, a past that had left its own scars, both visible and hidden. The cracked leather felt like his own skin. He stood there for a long time, his hand resting on the saddle, a silent communion with ghosts. By the time Mara ventured out again to fetch a bucket of water from the town well, the sun was sinking behind the Blue Lantern Range, painting the sky in violent streaks of purple and orange. The heat of the day was beginning to bleed away, replaced by a cool evening breeze that carried the promise of the coming autumn. The town was quieter now. The market had packed up, and the lamps were being lit in the windows of the houses and the saloon, casting warm, yellow rectangles onto the darkening street. As she walked back toward the boarding house, her bucket heavy and sloshing, she saw a rider silhouetted against the dramatic sky. It was Elias Thorne, his wagon gone. Now mounted on a sturdy-looking bay horse, he was heading out of town, back to his solitary ridge. He reined in his horse as he drew near her, touching the brim of his hat. "Evening, ma'am," he said. His voice was low, blending with the evening quiet. "Good evening, Mr. Thorne," Mara replied, stopping and shifting the weight of the bucket. There was a pause, a pocket of silence filled only by the creak of his saddle and the whisper of the wind. There were 100 things they could have said, questions to ask, pleasantries to exchange, but the habit of silence was strong in him, and the caution of a newcomer was strong in her. So they said nothing more. He nudged his horse forward, and she continued on her way. A simple greeting, a nod of acknowledgement. It was nothing, and yet it was something. It was the first fragile thread of connection, thin but strong, tying them both to the dusty, hopeful, and lonesome heart of Juniper Ford. The sky deepened to a dark, bruised purple, and the first stars began to appear, sharp and brilliant in the clear desert air. The schoolhouse smelled of pine sap and old dust. Sunlight, thick with dancing motes, streamed through the 2 tall windows, laying warm rectangles on the rough-hewn floorboards. Mara Lind dipped a rag into a bucket of black, viscous paint and began to spread it across the scarred face of the blackboard. The scraping sound was satisfying, a physical act of making something new. With each stroke, she covered the faint, ghostly outlines of sums and letters left by the teacher before her, creating a smooth, dark void ready for a fresh start. Her start. Her students, a collection of 7 children between the ages of 6 and 11, sat at mismatched wooden desks, their feet bare and dusty. They were farm children, ranch children, their face already weathered by the sun, their knuckles often scraped. They watched her with the solemn, unwavering curiosity of the young. For them, a new teacher was a new season, an unknown climate to be navigated. Mara had already learned their names: little Nellie Hart, with the wide, worried eyes, Samuel and Peter, brothers who communicated in a series of nudges and silent looks, and the others, each a small, fiercely independent citizen of this vast, hard country. She had laid out the spelling primers, their pages stiff and smelling of paper and ink. The simple weight of the books in her hands felt like an anchor. The schoolhouse door creaked open, letting in a slice of the bright, windy day. Elias Thorne stood framed in the doorway, a bundle of split cedar logs cradled in his arms. He was larger in the small room than he had been in the open street, his shoulders seeming to brush both sides of the doorframe. He moved with a quiet purpose that absorbed sound, his boots making almost no noise on the floor. "Parson Reed asked me to bring this by," he said, his voice a low rumble that didn't seem intended to carry. "For the stove. Nights are getting a chill." He didn't look at Mara directly, his gaze fixed on the pot-belly stove in the corner of the room. He moved toward it and began to stack the wood neatly in the kindling box beside it. The children all turned to watch him, this quiet, formidable man from the hills who rarely came to town and spoke even less. Mara's hands, stained with black paint, stilled on the blackboard. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice clear in the sudden silence. "And of the parson. We're grateful." He gave a short, sharp nod, his back still mostly to her. He finished his task. The last log settled silently onto the pile. As he straightened up, little Nellie Hart, braver in her innocence than any adult, piped up. "Mr. Thorne, what's that on your arm?" Elias froze. Not a dramatic, sudden halt, but a deep, internal stillness, as if a switch had been flipped somewhere inside him. Mara's eyes followed Nellie's pointing finger. A pale, jagged scar ran from his wrist halfway up his forearm, the skin puckered and white against his tanned skin. It looked old, but it had been a terrible wound. He slowly turned, and, for the first time, he let his gaze fall on the children. It was a guarded look, but the hardness in it seemed to soften slightly as he looked at their small, upturned faces. He flexed the fingers of his scarred hand, a slow, deliberate movement. "Old rope burn," he said, the words clipped, "from a stubborn horse." He offered the explanation to the children, but Mara felt it was for her benefit, as well a neat, plausible story, to close a door he had no intention of letting anyone open. He had answered, but he had not shared. There was a world of difference. A tension lingered in the air. To break it, Mara turned back to the class with a determined brightness. "All right, everyone, before we begin our spelling, I have a story about a word, a very simple word." She wiped her hands on a clean rag and faced them, leaning against her desk. "The word is home." The children looked at her, their attention recaptured. Elias, who had been about to leave, found his feet had stopped moving. He stood by the door, one hand on the latch, an unwilling spectator. "Some people think home is just the building you live in," Mara began, her voice becoming softer, more intimate. "A roof, 4 walls, a door. But the word is much older than that. It comes from an old idea of a place where you belong. Not just a place to sleep, but a place where your heart can rest. It doesn't have to have a fine roof or a painted door. It can be a wagon, or a campfire, or just the circle of light from a lantern. It's the place." She paused, looking from one child to another. "Where you don't have to be afraid, where you are safe." Samuel and Peter giggled at the idea of a campfire being a home. Nellie Hart smiled, a rare and lovely sight, but Elias did not move. He stood utterly still, his hand still on the door, his face unreadable. The word home had struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had a ranch, a house he had built with his own hands. He had shelter, but he had not felt safe, not truly, in a very long time. Mara's simple definition had unearthed a longing in him, so deep and so old he had forgotten it was there. It was in that quiet moment, thick with unspoken meaning, that a shadow fell across the doorway. A woman stood there, her figure silhouetted against the bright day. She was not a Juniper Ford woman. Her dress was of a finer cut, though dusty from travel, and she held herself with an assurance that was almost predatory. Her hair was a dark, rich auburn, and her eyes, when she stepped into the room, were a sharp, intelligent green. She ignored Mara completely. Her gaze swept past the children and landed on Elias Thorne with an unnerving familiarity, a look of ownership. "Elias," she said. Her voice was like smooth whiskey, low and a little smoky. "I figured I'd find you hiding in a church or a schoolhouse. You always did have a soft spot for lost causes." The air in the room grew thin, charged with a sudden, dangerous electricity. Elias's body went rigid. The quiet rancher who had stacked wood so carefully was gone, replaced by a man who looked like a cornered animal. Mara watched his face and saw a history she couldn't have imagined flicker in his eyes, a history of smoke-filled rooms, of desperate choices, of a life lived far from the quiet solitude of dry Cedar Ridge. This woman was a part of that life, a ghost made flesh. "Rosalind," Elias said, his voice flat and hard as stone. "What are you doing here?" "Business," she replied with a cool smile that didn't reach her eyes. She let her gaze drift over Mara for the first time. A quick, dismissive appraisal. "And tying up loose ends, I have a message for you." She stepped closer, lowering her voice so the children couldn't hear. "The full moon is in 3 nights. Meet me at the old wooden bridge east of town, midnight." It was not a request. Elias said nothing. His jaw was a hard line, his silence more powerful than any shouted reply. Rosalind Pike seemed to expect it. She looked at his clenched fists, then back at his face. "Don't be a fool, Elias. Not again," she murmured, then turned and walked out as quickly as she had appeared, leaving a wake of silence behind her. The children were quiet, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, the intrusion of something adult and complicated. The sunny little schoolroom now felt confining, the air heavy with secrets. Mara's heart was pounding. She took a steadying breath. "All right, children, open your primers to page 10. She tried to bring the day back to its simple purpose, but the spell was broken. After a few minutes of distracted spelling, she dismissed them for their midday meal. They scattered out into the sunshine, their chatter slowly returning, leaving Mara and Elias alone in the suddenly cavernous room. He still hadn't moved from the door. He looked like a man trapped in a memory, his eyes seeing something far beyond the walls of the schoolhouse. Mara walked over to the lunch pail she'd packed that morning. "I have extra cornbread, Mr. Thorne," she said softly, breaking the thick silence. "You're welcome to stay and share some with me." For a moment, she thought he hadn't heard her. Then, slowly, he turned his head and looked at her, really looked at her. She saw the conflict in his pale gray eyes, a flicker of warmth warring with a cold, hard shadow. A part of him wanted to stay, to sit in the quiet, sunlit room and eat simple food with a kind woman. She saw him nod, a barely perceptible motion, a surrender to that small, hopeful part of himself. But then the shadow won. The ghost of Rosalind Pike was still in the room with them. He shook his head, a sharp, decisive negation of his first impulse. "No," he said, his voice raw. "I have to be going." He turned and left without another word. Pulling the door shut behind him, Mara stood there, a piece of cornbread in her hand, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading away. She went to the window and watched him cross the dusty yard to where his horse was tethered to a post. He moved with a stiff, unnatural control. As he reached for the reins to untie them, she saw it. His hand, the one with the long, white scar, was trembling. It was not a violent shake, but a fine, deep tremor, the kind that comes not from cold or weakness, but from a profound and deeply rooted fear, a fear he had lived with for so long it had become a part of him, a fear that woman had just brought back to his doorstep. 3 nights later, a full moon rose over the Blue Lantern Range, stripping the landscape of color and leaving it etched in silver and shadow. The Ash Willow River, usually a muddy brown, ran like a blade of polished steel under the cold, white light. A wind, born in the high, lonely places, snaked down through the canyons, carrying with it the distant, mournful cry of a wolf. It was a sound that spoke of hunger and solitude, a fitting soundtrack for the night. Elias Thorne rode his horse, humbler, at a slow walk. The rhythmic creak of his saddle the only sound in the immediate quiet. He kept to the shadows where he could, a habit born of a life he was trying to forget. The wooden bridge was a dark slash across the shimmering river, a place of transit, of choices. As he approached, a figure detached itself from the deeper shadows of the cottonwood trees on the far bank. Rosalind. She stood with her arms crossed, the moonlight catching the auburn in her hair. She looked as if she belonged to the night, a creature of dusk and secrets. Elias dismounted, leaving Humbler untethered, knowing the horse would not stray. He walked to the center of the bridge, the planks groaning under his weight, and stopped a good 10 feet from her. "You came," she said. It was not a greeting. It was a confirmation of her power over him. "You knew I would," he answered, his voice flat. "What is it?" "Rosalind, what trouble are you dragging to my door this time?" She smiled, a slow, knowing expression that held no warmth. "It's the same trouble it's always been, Elias, a debt. You walked away from one, but that doesn't mean it was paid." She took a step closer, the scent of her perfume, something floral and out of place in the wild sage-scented air, reaching him. "The Hollow Spur boys, they have long memories, and they have a business to run." The story hung between them, unspoken but alive. A frantic ride, a doctor's bag filled with more than just medicine, a child's feverish cries in a hidden cabin. He had done a desperate thing for her once, believing he was saving a life. And he had. But that one ride had led to another, and the cargo had changed from smuggled laudanum to rifles. That was where he had drawn the line. He had taken their money for the first job and vanished, leaving them waiting at a rendezvous point with a shipment of guns that never arrived. He had bought his ranch with that money, hoping to bury his past under acres of hard work and solitude. But the past was not so easily buried. "I don't owe them anything," Elias said, his voice low and hard. "And I don't owe you." "Don't you?" Rosalind's voice was soft, persuasive. "They're moving a special shipment, valuable. They need a guide who knows the passes, someone who won't be noticed, someone reliable." She let the word hang in the air. "They need you to take one small package across the border, that's all. One ride, and the debt is cleared. They'll forget the name Elias Thorne ever existed. You'll have your peace. Your quiet little ranch will be safe." He could feel the pull of it, the seductive promise of a clean slate, to be free of the constant fear of a rider appearing on the horizon, of a shadow falling across his door. But he knew her promises were traps, each one leading to a smaller cage. "No," he said. The word was final. "I'm done riding for them. I'm done riding for you." Rosalind's expression hardened, the manufactured charm falling away to reveal the cold calculation beneath. She didn't argue. She didn't threaten him directly. Instead, her eyes, gleaming in the moonlight, shifted, looking past him, back toward the faint, scattered lights of Juniper Ford. "It's a quiet town," she said, her voice conversational, yet laced with menace. "Nice people. A new school teacher, I hear, so dedicated to her little flock. It would be a shame if trouble found its way there. Things can get so messy when desperate men feel they've been cheated." It was a blade, slid cleanly between his ribs. She wasn't threatening his ranch. She was threatening his sanctuary. She was threatening the fragile possibility of a life he had only just begun to imagine. She was threatening Mara. He said nothing, but she saw the hit land in the sudden tension of his shoulders. She had found his weakness. She smiled again, this time with genuine satisfaction. "Midnight, 1 week from tonight. Be here. The package will be waiting." She turned and melted back into the shadows of the cottonwoods, leaving him alone on the bridge with the howling of the wind and the poison of her words. He stood there for a long time, the moonlight feeling like a harsh interrogator's lamp. He was trapped. To protect the town, to protect her, it seemed he would have to become the man he had tried so hard to kill. The ride back was different. The night, which had been solemn, now felt predatory. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. He was halfway to town when he saw a lantern swinging frantically by the side of the road. A small, desperate star in the overwhelming dark. He spurred Humbler forward, a cold dread coiling in his gut. It was Mara. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and her face was pale with panic in the lantern light. She was alone. "Mr. Thorne," she cried out, relief and fear warring in her voice. "Thank God." He swung down from the saddle before the horse had even fully stopped. "What is it? What's wrong?" "It's Nellie," she said, her voice trembling. "Nellie Hart. Her mother came to me an hour ago. Nellie went out after supper to gather fallen branches for the kindling box, and she hasn't come back. We've searched the area around their cabin, but there's no sign of her." Elias's own problems evaporated, consumed by this immediate, terrible crisis. A small child, alone in the dark, with the night growing colder and predators on the prowl. He took the lantern from her trembling hand, his own steady and sure. "Where did she go?" he asked, his voice calm and authoritative, cutting through her panic. "Her mother said she likes to go down by the creek, where the reeds are thick. She calls it her secret castle." "Show me," he said. They moved quickly, Mara half running to keep up with his long, urgent strides. They left the road, plunging into the scrubland that bordered the creek. The air grew damp and cool. "Nellie." Mara's voice was high and sharp with fear, a sound that was quickly swallowed by the vast, indifferent night. "Nellie Hart." Elias's voice was different. It was a deep baritone, a powerful sound that rolled across the land, carrying authority and the promise of safety. "Answer me, child." They called and called, their voices weaving together in the darkness, a duet of hope against a chorus of chirping crickets and the rustle of unseen things in the brush. For a long time, the only answer was the sighing of the wind through the tall, dry reeds. The moon cast strange, shifting patterns on the ground, turning familiar shapes into monstrous forms. Just as a sliver of despair began to creep into Mara's heart, they heard it, a faint, weak cry, almost indistinguishable from the bleating of a lamb. "Help me!" It came from the thickest part of the reeds, near the water's edge. "We're coming, Nellie," Elias shouted, his voice a beacon. He pushed through the dense reeds, which clawed at his clothes, Mara following close behind. Holding the lantern high, they found her huddled on a small patch of muddy ground, her dress torn and her face stained with tears. She had slipped down the muddy bank, and her foot was caught fast in a thick tangle of roots at the water's edge. "I'm stuck," she whimpered, shivering violently from cold and fear. Elias handed the lantern back to Mara and waded into the shallow, icy water without hesitation. He worked gently, his large, scarred hands surprisingly nimble as he untangled the roots from around her small ankle. Once she was free. He lifted her easily into his arms. She buried her face in his shoulder, her small body shaking. He carried her back up the slippery bank. Mara, in her haste to help, misjudged her footing on the slick mud. She slipped, crying out as she landed in the frigid water up to her knees. The cold was a violent shock, stealing her breath. Elias was at her side in an instant, Nellie still secure in one arm. He reached down with his free hand and pulled her effortlessly to her feet. "I'm all right," she gasped, though her teeth were already chattering. Her skirts were soaked, clinging to her legs like a cold, heavy shroud. He didn't say a word. He settled Nellie more securely on his hip, and then, with his other hand, he began to unbutton his heavy canvas coat. He shrugged it off and, before she could protest, draped it around her shoulders. It was immense on her, heavy and warm from his body, and smelled of cedar smoke, leather, and the clean scent of the wind. The warmth began to seep into her chilled bones immediately, a profound comfort that went far beyond mere heat. She clutched it around herself, overwhelmed by the simple, powerful gesture of his care. They walked back toward the road in silence, the only sounds their footsteps and Nellie's quiet sniffles. The moon had climbed higher, and as they stepped out of the shadows of the creek bed, it illuminated them. A strange little tableau, the big silent man carrying a child, and the woman wrapped in his coat. When they reached his horse, he finally spoke, his voice low and rough. He was looking at her, his pale eyes searching her face in the moonlight. The question seemed to be pulled from a deep, wounded place inside him. "Are you afraid of me?" Mara stopped, surprised by the raw vulnerability in the question. She thought of the whispers in town, of his solitary nature, of the hardness she'd seen in his face when Rosaline appeared. She thought of the ugly scar on his arm, and then she thought of the gentleness with which his hands had freed a frightened child, and the immediate, unthinking warmth of his coat around her shoulders. She met his gaze directly, her own clear and unwavering. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not afraid of you, Mr. Thorne." She pulled the heavy coat tighter, a shield against more than just the cold. "I'm more afraid of silence, of the things people don't say." His breath hitched, a tiny, almost imperceptible sound. Her answer had reached past the question he had asked and touched the truth he was hiding. It was an offer, an opening, an invitation to trust. A cloud slid past the moon, and for a moment they were plunged into darkness, before the silver light returned, sharper than before. In that moment, something shifted between them. A line had been crossed. They had faced the darkness together, a small one, but it was enough, standing there on the side of a lonely road, with a lost child safe in his arms. They had, without a word, chosen to stand on the same shore, facing the same unknown tide. The Nickel Star Saloon was the beating heart of Juniper Ford, and that evening, its pulse was a nervous, frantic rhythm. The air was thick with the smells of stale beer, sweat, and cheap tobacco smoke, a haze that blurred the edges of the room and softened the light from the kerosene lamps. A man with a battered banjo plucked a tune that was more agitated than cheerful, a soundtrack for the rumors that skittered from table to table like spilled whiskey. The words were whispered, low and urgent package. Hollow Spur, the border, a guide who knows the dark passes. The whispers were formless, a ghost of a story, but they were enough to create a current of unease that pulled every man in the room a little closer to the handle of his pistol. Mara Lind felt the tension the moment she pushed through the swinging doors. She had come for a simple reason, Mrs. Gable, her landlady, had sent her to fetch Parson Reed for a late-night supper invitation. She'd been told he was likely at the saloon, trying to save a few souls before they were pickled for the night. The noise, the smoke, the sheer press of bodies was an assault on her senses. It was a world away from her quiet schoolhouse, a masculine space built of rough wood and loud boasts. She scanned the room, her eyes skipping over the card players and the solitary drinkers, searching for the parson's familiar black coat. Instead, a different figure caught her eye. Rosaline Pike was holding court at a small table near the back, a glass of amber liquid in her hand. She looked perfectly at ease, an exotic flower thriving in the smoky soil of the saloon. Her gaze swept the room and locked onto Mara with an unnerving precision. A slow smile spread across her lips, and she beckoned with a single, elegant finger. It was not an invitation, it was a summons. Mara hesitated. Every instinct told her to turn and leave, to retreat to the safety of the street. But the memory of Elias's trembling hand, of the fear Rosaline had so effortlessly ignited in him, held her in place. She felt a surge of something she could only name as protective anger. Ignoring the summons would be the sensible thing to do, but it also felt like a retreat. Taking a steadying breath, Mara navigated her way through the crowded room, her simple dress a stark contrast to Rosaline's fashionable attire. "Miss Lynn," Rosalind purred as Mara approached. "How brave of you to venture into our little den of iniquity. Please, join me." She indicated the empty chair opposite her. "I have something I want to show you." Reluctantly, Mara sat. The banjo music seemed to grow louder, more insistent. Rosalind reached into a small purse and drew out a string of pearls. Even in the dim, smoky light, they had a soft luster. Though Mara could see that they were old, the surface of each pearl marked with tiny scratches and imperfections, like memories of 1,000 nights. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Rosaline said, letting them pool in her palm. "A gift, from a man who owed me a great deal." She lifted her gaze to meet Mara's. "Elias is like that. He always pays his debts. Did you know he once owed me his very life?" The statement was delivered casually, a piece of gossip shared between friends, but it was a carefully aimed dart. Mara felt the sting of it. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her posture as straight and unyielding as the chalk she used on her blackboard. "Mr. Thorne seems like a man who values his independence," Mara said, her voice even and calm, betraying none of the turmoil she felt inside. "I can't imagine him being indebted to anyone for long." Rosalind's smile tightened. "Oh, some debts are for a lifetime. My dear, they wrap around you like a rope, and the more you struggle, the tighter they pull." As she spoke, 2 men entered the saloon. They moved differently from the local ranchers and prospectors. They walked with a predator's swagger, their eyes constantly moving, assessing angles, exits, and threats. One was a tall, wiry man with a long, cruel face and a nervous energy that made him seem constantly on the verge of violence. The other was broader, quieter, with dead, empty eyes. They gave Rosaline a curt nod as they passed her table. The tall one, Jax Murdoch, paused to look out the front window, his gaze measuring the distance to the livery stable across the street. The quiet one, Clive Rowe, leaned against the bar, his hand never straying far from the Colt revolver holstered on his hip. The Hollow Spur Gang. The name from the whispers now had faces, and they were hard, unforgiving faces. At that moment, the saloon door swung open again. Elias Thorne stepped inside. He had come to settle his account at the Mercantile before it closed and had seen Mara's silhouette through the saloon window. A cold, sharp fear, an emotion he thought he had mastered, had seized him. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom, and the first thing he saw was Mara, trapped at a table with the source of all his trouble. The second thing he saw was the look Rosaline gave her, a look of cold, calculating appraisal, like a butcher measuring a cut of meat. It was the same look she had given him years ago, right before she had asked him to do the unthinkable. His presence changed the atmosphere of the room. The whispers died. The card players paused their game. He was just a solitary rancher, but he carried with him an aura of quiet danger, a history that the town could only guess at. He ignored the other men, ignored the sudden silence. His focus was entirely on the table at the back. "Rosaline," he said, his voice a low growl that cut through the banjo music. She looked up, a triumphant gleam in her eyes. "Elias, perfect timing." She stood, her movements fluid and graceful, and looped her arm through his. "You owe me a dance." It was a challenge, thrown down in front of the entire town. To refuse would be to show weakness, to admit her hold on him. He could feel the eyes of Jax and Clive on his back. He was caught, with a face like carved stone. He allowed her to lead him to the small, clear space in the center of the room. The banjo player, sensing the drama, switched to a slow, mournful waltz. Their dance was not a dance at all. It was a confrontation, a silent battle of wills set to music. Rosaline pressed close to him, her lips near his ear, her words a venomous whisper meant only for him. "You see how easy it is I can touch any part of your new life. Elias, I can turn it sour. All you have to do is say yes, one ride, think of her." Her head tilted infinitesimally toward Mara. Elias's body was stiff, his movements mechanical, his hands resting on her back with the careful distaste of a man handling a snake. He stared over her head, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. Mara couldn't bear to watch. It felt like an intrusion, a violation of something she didn't even have a name for yet. The sight of him, so contained and proud, being manipulated in this public spectacle was more than she could stand. She stood up abruptly, knocking her chair slightly. and pushed her way toward the door. She needed air. She needed to escape the suffocating weight of the past that was filling the room. She stepped out into the cool night air, leaning against the porch rail and drawing in a deep, shuddering breath. The wind felt clean, washing away the saloon's smoky stench. The stars were sharp and clear above, but the peace was shattered by a sudden, sharp noise from inside, the unmistakable sound of shattering glass, followed by a man's angry shout. Her heart leaped into her throat. Without a second thought, she turned and burst back through the doors. The scene inside had frozen into a terrifying tableau. Rosaline stood by the table, her face contorted in a snarl of fury. The glass she had been drinking from lay in glittering shards on the floor. In front of her, blocking her from Mara's empty chair, stood Elias. He had moved with impossible speed, his body a solid, immovable wall between the two women. The waltz had stopped. The banjo was silent. The entire saloon was as quiet as a church on a Monday morning. Jax Murdoch and Clive Rowe had straightened up, their hands now resting on their guns, their expressions cold and watchful. Rosaline pointed a trembling finger at Elias, her voice shaking with rage. "You will not walk away from me again! Elias, you will not!" But it was Mara's voice that cut through the charged silence. It wasn't loud. It was as quiet as a prayer. Yet every single person in the room heard it as clearly as a gunshot. She looked directly at Elias, her gaze steady, her chin high. "Don't owe anything more." The words were simple, but they were a declaration. They were a plea and a command. They were an offer of an alliance in a war she was only just beginning to understand. For a moment, Elias didn't move. He just looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of something she had not seen before, not just gratitude, but a dawning, astonished hope. He had been fighting his ghosts alone for so long, and here was someone, this quiet schoolteacher with hands stained by blackboard paint, willing to stand in the darkness beside him. The debt to Rosalind suddenly seemed like a flimsy, brittle thing compared to the solid, quiet strength in Mara's eyes. The trail to Dry Cedar Ridge was less a road and more a suggestion. It climbed out of the valley, leaving the clustered safety of Juniper Ford behind, and wound its way into a landscape of stark, quiet beauty. The ground was rocky, dotted with stubborn clumps of sagebrush and the sparse, twisted cedars that gave the ridge its name. On the Sunday after the confrontation at the Nickel Star, Mara Lind rode a borrowed mule up that trail, a small satchel of books and a lunch pail tied to the saddle. She had arranged it with Parson Reed. A few of the outlying ranch families had children who couldn't make the daily trip to town for school, and she had offered to hold a lesson for them once a week. It was a practical arrangement, born of her duty as a teacher. But as the mule picked its way over the stones, Mara knew, with a certainty that was both frightening and exhilarating, that she was not just going to teach the alphabet, she was going to see Elias Thorne in his own world. The ranch was not what she expected. There was no grand house, no sprawling operation. It was a small, defensible basin carved out of the ridge, with a sturdy, one-room cabin built of dark, weathered logs, a solid-looking barn, and a web of clean, tight fences. Everything was spare, functional, and meticulously maintained. It was the landscape of a man who owned little but took care of what he had. 3 children were already there, waiting on the cabin's porch steps, their faces scrubbed clean for the Sunday lesson. Elias was not on the porch. He was out by the far fence line, his back to the cabin, working. He moved with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a man who knows his labor is never truly done. He didn't turn when she arrived, though she knew he had heard her approach. It wasn't a slight. It was an acknowledgement of her purpose. She was here for the children. He had his own work to do. This quiet understanding settled over the ranch, a silence that wasn't empty, but full of shared, unspoken boundaries. Mara set up her makeshift classroom on the porch. She had the children trace letters in a shallow pan of sand, their small, rough fingers struggling to form the elegant curves. She read to them from a primer, her voice clear and steady in the vast quiet, a small, civilized sound against the backdrop of the wind and the distant lowing of cattle. From the corner of her eye, she could see Elias. He was replacing a fence post, digging the hole with a long-handled auger, his movements economical and powerful. The sun beat down, and soon a dark patch of sweat stained the back of his gray shirt. He took off his hat, wiped his brow with his forearm, and set it back on his head. A simple, repeated gesture of a man at work. Now and then, a gust of wind would carry the sharp, rhythmic sound of his hammer driving a staple into the new post, a percussive counterpoint to the soft murmur of her reading voice. She tied her bonnet tighter against the breeze, the ribbons tickling her neck. The hem of her dress was soon dusty, and a sharp blade of wild grass left a small, stinging cut on her ankle. In the schoolhouse, she was the teacher and figure of authority in a controlled world. Here, she was just a woman on a porch, while the real, raw world went on around her. But she did not feel small. She felt present, grounded. The scent of the dry earth, the heat of the sun on her hands, the sound of a man working to hold his world together. It was more real than anything she had ever known. Their silence was not heavy or awkward. It was the comfortable silence of two people engaged in their own essential tasks, aware and respectful of the other's orbit. When the sun was high and the children's attention began to fray, she dismissed them for the day, watching as they ran off toward the small homesteads scattered across the neighboring hills. She packed her books, her hands feeling gritty with dust and sand. "Ma'am," his voice, coming from just behind her, made her startle. He had moved as silently as a shadow. He stood on the bottom step, holding his hat in his hands. His face was streaked with dirt, and his shirt was damp with sweat, but his pale eyes were clear. "I have food," he said. It was a statement, not an offer. He gestured with his head toward the cabin. They ate on the porch steps, the same steps where she had just been teaching. He brought out 2 tin plates with thick slices of salty, cured pork, pieces of cornbread, and a handful of dark, sweet plums from a jar. It was simple, unadorned food, and it tasted better than anything Mara had eaten in weeks. They sat a respectable distance apart, the warm wood of the steps beneath them, and looked out over the basin. The silence stretched, but now it felt different. The work was done, for the moment, and the quiet was an invitation. "It's so different from back east," Mara said, her voice soft. "The winters there, they have a weight to them. The snow falls for days until you can't see the fences. The world gets very small, very quiet, and very, very cold. Sometimes you feel like the sun will never come back." She looked down at the cornbread in her hands. "That's why I came here. I wanted to see a place where the sky was too big to be buried." He was quiet for a long time, chewing his food slowly. She thought he wasn't going to respond, that she had presumed too much. "This land has its own way of burying a man," he said at last, his voice low. He looked over at his horse, Humbler, who stood swishing his tail in the shade of the barn. "That horse, he saved my life once. I was in a bad spot. Rode him for 2 days straight through a blizzard in the high country. No food, and men behind me I had no wish to see. Any other horse would have given up, laid down and died, but he just kept going." He traced a line on his tin plate with his fork. "Found a hunter's lean-to just as I was about to fall out of the saddle. We holed up there for 3 days. The wind sounded like a woman screaming. I thought we were both going to die, but we didn't." He looked at Mara, a directness in his gaze that made her heart skip. "He taught me something. You don't have to be the strongest. You just have to be the last one to quit." It was the most he had ever said to her, a story that explained everything and nothing at all. Men behind me I had no wish to see. Rosalind, the hollow spur. He was giving her a piece of his history, a piece of the truth, without speaking their names. It was a gift, an act of trust. and it filled the space between them with a warm, quiet intimacy. The moment was shattered by a sound that was utterly alien to the peaceful afternoon, the sharp, flat crack of a rifle shot. It wasn't close, but it was clear. In an instant, Elias was transformed. The quiet man sharing a story was gone. He was on his feet before the echo had died, his body coiled and alert, his eyes scanning the ridgeline that surrounded the basin, a small herd of his cattle, which had been grazing peacefully on the far slope, broke and scattered, their panic a clear signal of the disturbance. Then they saw it, a small, lazy puff of white smoke rising from a thicket of cedars on the northern ridge. It was a long way off, too far to be a direct threat to them, but it was not a hunter's shot. It was a message. Elias moved without a word, grabbing a bucket half filled with water from beside the cabin door and striding toward the fence line where he'd been working. Mara followed, her heart pounding a heavy, fearful rhythm against her ribs. As they drew closer, the acrid smell of smoke reached them. A small patch of dry grass at the base of the new fence post he had just installed was smoldering, the flames already beginning to lick at the wood. Elias doused the fire with a practiced efficiency, the water hissing as it hit the hot embers. The immediate danger was gone, but a darker threat remained. There, burned black into the fresh, pale wood of the new post, was a crude, ugly symbol, a spur with a hollow center, a brand, a warning. The Hollow Spur gang had been here. They had been watching him. They had been watching them. Elias's eyes went dark, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He stared at the symbol, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. This was Rosalind's answer to the standoff in the saloon. This was her pulling the rope tighter. "We have to tell the sheriff," Mara said, her voice tight with a fear she refused to let show. "Caleb Rusk, he can form a posse." Elias shook his head, his gaze still locked on the burned wood. "No," he said, the word clipped and final. "This isn't the law's business. It's mine." He finally looked at her, and she saw the terrible weight of his past in his eyes. "This is a debt I have to pay myself. Rusk is a good man, but he's a town man. He doesn't know the men we're dealing with. He'd be leading his posse into a slaughter." "So what will you do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You can't just wait for them to come back." "I won't," he said grimly. "They left a message. I'll leave one of my own." He looked up at the sky, judging the remaining light. "But they'll be watching. Not tonight, maybe, but soon, tonight. I'll watch back." The sun was beginning to dip toward the jagged peaks of the mountains, and the air was growing cool. It was time for her to go. The peaceful afternoon felt like a distant dream, the memory of it already tainted by the smell of smoke and fear. She gathered her things, her hands feeling clumsy and slow. He walked with her to where the mule was tethered, the silence between them now heavy with the threat of the coming night. She mounted the mule, her skirts settling around her. He stood by her side, his face a grim silhouette against the setting sun. She should leave. She should ride back to the relative safety of town and lock her door. That was the sensible thing to do. But as she looked down at his face, at the hard line of his jaw and the deep loneliness in his eyes, she knew she couldn't. She couldn't leave him to face this alone. The memory of his story, of the man who just refused to quit, rose in her mind. She leaned down slightly, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the rising evening wind. "If I asked you to stay," she said, the words coming out in a soft rush, "would you?" It was a strange, inverted question. She was asking him to stay here, in his own home, in the heart of the danger. But he understood her meaning perfectly. She wasn't asking him to stay put. She was asking him not to go out and meet the trouble head on, not to ride into the darkness to settle a debt. She was asking him to stay with the living, to stay with the possibility of a future, to stay with her. He looked up at her, his expression utterly still. The last light of the sun caught the pale gray of his eyes, and in their depths, She saw a profound and weary battle being waged. He had been a solitary fighter for so long, and she was offering him the one thing he had forgotten he could ever have an ally. His answer was not in words. It was in the sudden, sharp intake of his breath, in the way the tension in his shoulders seemed to lessen, just for a moment. But before he could speak, the world answered for him. A change came over the air. The wind, which had been a steady whisper, died away into an unnerving silence. The birds stopped singing. A strange, yellow-gray light began to seep into the sky, leaching the color from the landscape. From the west, over the high, jagged peaks of the Blue Lantern Range, it came, a wall of roiling brown dust, a solid thing that seemed to devour the sky as it advanced. The sound came next, a low, guttural rumble that was not thunder, but the sound of the earth itself being scoured and lifted by the wind. The sky above the dust cloud turned the color of a lead slug. "Get inside," Elias said, his voice sharp, urgent. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the barn. "The cabin's too exposed. The barn's built tighter." They were halfway across the yard when the first gust hit, a physical blow that staggered them. The air filled with grit that stung their eyes and coated their teeth. The cattle, which had been clustered near the water trough, broke into a blind panic, their bellows of terror torn away by the wind. They surged against the fence line, a wave of terrified muscle and bone. There was a sharp crack, like a pistol shot, as a section of the fence splintered and gave way. The herd, now a stampeding mob, poured through the gap, vanishing into the brown maelstrom. "The doors!" Elias yelled over the rising roar of the wind. "Help me with the doors!" They reached the wide barn doors, two massive slabs of wood that were already beginning to shudder and boom in their frames. He took one side, she took the other, their combined weight barely enough to force the doors shut against the pressure of the wind. Elias fumbled for the thick wooden crossbar, his fingers stiff with cold and tension. As he struggled to lift it into place, Mara threw her entire body against the groaning wood, her shoulder pressed hard, her feet sliding in the dirt. It was in this moment of chaotic struggle, their world reduced to the wind's scream and the straining of wood, that the riders appeared. They emerged from the dust cloud like apparitions, their forms hazy and indistinct at first, then resolving into three figures on horseback. Rosaline Pike sat her horse with an unnatural calm, her face wrapped in a silk scarf, only her cold, determined eyes visible. Beside her were Jax Murdoch and Clive Rowe, their hats pulled low, their dusters whipping in the wind like broken wings. They reined in their horses a dozen yards from the barn, an island of menace in the heart of the storm. "Convenient weather. Elias." Rosalind's voice was surprisingly clear, cutting through the gale. "Saves us the trouble of knocking. We need your barn just for a little while. A safe place to store some merchandise." Elias finally slammed the heavy bar into its iron brackets. Securing the doors, he turned, placing himself between Mara and the riders, his body a shield. "Get out of here! Rosaline!" he shouted back, the wind snatching the words from his mouth. "This is my place. You're not welcome." Jax Murdoch laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "We ain't asking for an invitation." As if on cue, the sky tore open. A jagged bolt of lightning, brilliant and blinding, struck a tall, solitary pine tree on the ridge above the cabin. The explosion was instantaneous, a deafening crack that vibrated through the soles of their feet. The tree's top half disintegrated, and a moment later, orange flames, shockingly bright against the gray sky, began to consume the dry wood, fanned into a frenzy by the storm. The fire, the stampeding cattle, the screaming wind, it was chaos. In the confusion, Elias saw a section of corral fence near the barn begin to give way, the posts rocking in the wind-softened earth. If it went, his horse, Humbler, would be lost to the storm. He grabbed a coil of rope from a hook by the door, intending to lash the gate to a support beam. Rosaline saw his intent. "Forget the horse! Elias," she yelled. "Help them unload the packs! Be sensible!" He had the rope in his hands. He looked at the failing gate, at the terrified whinnying of the horse that had saved his life. Then he looked back at Mara, who stood pressed against the barn wall, her face pale but her eyes wide and defiant. In that split second, a choice was made. The past, with its debts and its dangers, was on one side. A fragile, uncertain future was on the other. He let the rope fall from his hands. He chose the future. He chose her. He took 2 steps and stood beside Mara, his hand hovering near the worn grip of his revolver. His decision was a declaration of war. Clive Rowe, the quiet one with the dead eyes, moved first. His hand blurred as he drew his pistol, but Elias was faster. He had lived with this kind of violence before. Its rhythms were buried deep in his muscles. His own gun was out, barking once, the shot a sharp counterpoint to the thunder. Clive grunted, staggering back, his own shot going wild and splintering the wood above Mara's head. He clutched at his shoulder, his face a mask of pained surprise. The world erupted into motion. Elias shoved Mara toward the partial cover of a water trough. "Stay down," he yelled, firing again, this time at Jax, forcing the man to duck behind his horse. Mara scrambled behind the trough, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw Elias's spare rifle lying on a rack just inside the barn door, which had been blown slightly ajar. An image flashed in her mind, a diagram from a worn copy of the U.S. Army Infantry Tactics Manual she had found in the schoolhouse storeroom. A simple drawing of a soldier loading a Springfield rifle. Cartridge, ram, prime, fire. Her hands were shaking, but she moved. She crawled to the door, grabbed the heavy rifle, and fumbled in the ammunition pouch hanging beside it. Her fingers were clumsy, numb with cold and fear. She dropped the first cartridge in the dirt. She took a breath, the taste of dust and ozone sharp in her mouth, and tried again. The brass cartridge felt impossibly small. Cartridge. She slid it home. Ram. She pushed the rod down the barrel. Prime. She pulled the hammer back to half cock. It was ready. It was the most terrifying thing she had ever held. She looked up just in time to see Jax Murdoch spur his horse forward, not at Elias, but at her. He leaned down from the saddle, his arm a steel band, and snatched her up, his hand tangling brutally in her hair. He dragged her from her cover, holding her in front of him, a human shield. "Drop it, Thorn!" Jax screamed, his voice raw with triumph. "Drop it, or the schoolteacher gets it!" Elias froze. He had Clive pinned down behind a wagon, but now the fight was over. He saw the terror in Mara's eyes, the cruel grip Jax had on her. The world narrowed to that single horrifying image. His gun felt impossibly heavy in his hand. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered it and let it fall to the dirt. "Let her go," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Not so simple," Jax sneered. He began to back his horse away, pulling Mara with him. "Wait," Elias said. His eyes went to his horse, Humbler, who was still rearing and plunging in the damaged corral. "You want something of value. You want payment for that old debt, take the horse." A stunned silence fell, broken only by the howl of the wind. Even Jax seemed momentarily taken aback. Clive, still clutching his bleeding shoulder, stared in disbelief. To a man in this country, a horse like Humbler was more than just property. It was a partner, a lifeline. It was freedom. "The horse for the woman," Elias said again, his voice steady. "He's worth more than any package you're carrying." It was Rosalind who broke the spell. She had been watching the entire exchange, her face unreadable. But when Elias offered his horse, something in her expression shifted. She looked at the raw, absolute certainty in his face, the utter lack of hesitation. He was giving away his own survival for this woman. It was a sacrifice so total, so far beyond the realm of debts and bargains she understood, that it seemed to shake her to her core. She had come here to pull a rope around his neck, and instead, she had watched him sever it with a blade of his own making. She had lost "Let her go, Jax," Rosaline said, her voice quiet but firm. "Take the horse." Jax hesitated. Then a greedy smile spread across his face. He shoved Mara violently away from him. She stumbled and fell to her knees in the mud. He dismounted, handed his reins to Clive, and strode toward the corral to claim his prize. Rosaline looked at Elias one last time, a strange, complex expression on her face, part respect, part disbelief, part something that might have been regret. "Tomorrow night," she said, her voice almost lost in the wind. "The bridge." Then she turned her horse and, with Clive and Jax leading a triumphant humbler, rode back into the swirling dust and disappeared. At that moment, the storm broke. The dust turned to mud as a torrential rain began to fall, hissing on the embers of the burning tree and plastering their hair to their faces. The immediate danger was gone, leaving behind only the wreckage and the cold. Elias walked over to Mara, his movements stiff, as if his body was only just remembering how to work. He knelt in the mud in front of her, ignoring the rain that streamed down his face. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment, and then gently, so gently, cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed away a streak of mud, his touch a small, warm point in the vast, cold storm. He looked into her eyes, and she saw the full cost of the last few minutes reflected in his. He asked her the question she had asked him. The words turned around, made new and urgent by everything that had just happened. "Will you stay?" She leaned into his touch, a small, involuntary movement. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was no longer hers alone. She looked at his face, at the exhaustion and the pain, and she knew her answer. "Stay," she said, her voice a raw whisper. "If you'll let me hold your share of the fear tonight." The fire in the hearth was the only source of warmth and light in the cabin, a small, crackling island of life against the storm's aftermath. Outside, the rain had softened to a steady drumming on the roof, and the wind moaned a low, mournful dirge through the cedars. The air smelled of wet earth, wood smoke, and the sharp, clean scent of ozone left by the lightning. Mara sat on a low stool by the fire, a thick wool blanket draped around her shoulders. She held a steaming mug of coffee in both hands, but she wasn't drinking. She was watching the flames, her knuckles white around the tin cup. A fine, uncontrollable tremor ran through her hands, a physical echo of the terror that had seized her only an hour before. The fear was a living thing. A cold beast curled in her stomach. Elias moved around the small cabin with a quiet, restless energy. He had checked the door, barred the window, and now he stood by the stone fireplace, leaning one arm against the mantel. He poured himself a mug of the same bitter, black coffee, the liquid sloshing as his own hands shook slightly. He had washed the mud from his face and hands, but a dark bruise was beginning to form on his cheekbone where he had hit the ground. He looked at Mara, at the relentless shaking of her hands, and a deep, unfamiliar ache settled in his chest. This was his world, his fight. He had never meant for it to touch her. "It's my fault," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I should have sent you back to town the moment Rosalind showed up at the schoolhouse. I should have known she'd—" "She'd what?" Mara looked up, her eyes clear and direct in the firelight, cutting through his self-recrimination. "She'd use a person as a weapon. How could you know that, and what would you have had me do, ride away and leave you to face them alone?" She set the mug down on the hearth with a sharp click, the shaking in her hands momentarily stilled by a surge of indignation. "I am not a child. Mr. Thorne. I made a choice to be here." The formality of his name hung between them, a relic of a time that no longer existed. He looked away from her intense gaze, back into the fire. "They took my horse." The words were flat, heavy with a loss that went far beyond a simple piece of property. "They took Humbler to hurt you," Mara said softly, her anger giving way to a deep, resonant empathy. "They thought he was what you valued most. They were wrong." His head snapped up, his pale eyes locking with hers. In that look, an entire conversation passed between them. He understood. She had seen his choice, the moment he let the rope fall, and she knew its meaning. He had chosen her over his own freedom, his own past. "She said tomorrow night," he said, the words pulling them back to the sharp edge of the present. "The bridge. She'll expect me to deliver for her now. She'll think I have no other choice." "But you do," Mara insisted, standing up and pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "We do. She thinks she has you trapped. That's our advantage. She'll be expecting a man who is broken. She won't be expecting a plan." And so, in the small, firelit cabin, surrounded by the deep, wet darkness of the storm-ravaged ridge, they began to build one. It was a desperate strategy, a simple thing forged from courage and necessity. "They want a package," Elias reasoned, pacing the short length of the room. "We'll give them one. A decoy. Something heavy, wrapped in oilcloth." "And the real package?" Mara asked. "There is no real package," he said grimly. "Not yet. What she wants is for me to become her guide, her mule. The package is just the first test. But whatever is in her saddlebags now, that's our prize. It's likely the ledgers, the proof of their entire operation. That's what we need to get to the law." "So you go to the bridge," Mara thought aloud, her mind working quickly. "And I create a diversion, draw them away, split their focus." "No," Elias said immediately, the word a hard, flat negation. He stopped his pacing and turned to face her, his expression fierce. "Absolutely not. You're not going anywhere near them. I'll handle this." "How?" she challenged, her voice just as firm as his. "You'll ride into a camp with at least 3 guns waiting for you. That's not a plan. That's a suicide. They'll be watching you, Elias, but they won't be watching me." Her eyes shone with a feverish intensity. "Rosaline, Jax, all of them. They see me as a weakness, a schoolteacher, a pawn. They will never, in 100 years, expect me to be a threat. I can walk right into the nickel star, right under their noses." He started to protest again, but she held up a hand. "Listen, I'll take a lantern to the saloon. A white lantern. I'll make a show of it. Tell everyone I'm collecting donations for new books. I'll put a fake package right on the bar. It will confuse them, make them think you've changed the plan, that you're using me as a go-between. While they're trying to figure it out, you'll be at the bridge, dealing with whoever they left to guard the real prize. We need a signal, and we need help." He stared at her, at the sheer, unbending force of her will. She was right. Her logic was as sharp and clean as a blade. Her perceived weakness was, in fact, their greatest strength. The idea of putting her in that much danger made him physically ill, but the tactical brilliance of it was undeniable. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. An hour later, they were in Juniper Ford. The town was dark and quiet. The streets turned to muddy rivers by the rain. They didn't go to the sheriff's office. They went to the small, tidy house behind the church, where a light still burned in the window. Parson Reed, a kind man with a deeply lined face, opened the door, his expression of surprise turning to grave concern as he took in their disheveled, mud-stained appearances. Inside, sitting by the parson's own fire, they found Deputy Caleb Rusk. He was a young man, barely older than 25, but he had steady eyes and a quiet competence that inspired confidence. He and the parson listened without interruption as Elias and Mara laid out the night's events, their voices low and urgent. When they had finished, Caleb Rusk leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. "So, this Rosalind Pike is running the Hollow Spur crew." "She's not just running them," Elias said, his voice rough with the effort of confession. "She owns them, and she thinks she owns me." He took a deep breath, and the rest of the story, the part he had kept buried for 5 long years, came pouring out. "It started with a debt. I was young, foolish, I owed money to the wrong people. Rosaline offered me a way out. She knew I could ride, that I knew the land. She needed a package of medicine brought over the mountains for a sick child. Quinine. The doctor wouldn't go. It was a good deed, she said. He looked into the fire, his eyes seeing a different time. And it was. I made the ride. The child lived. I thought that was the end of it. I'd paid my debt, but Rosaline, she said I'd done so well. There was another job, a much more profitable one. He finally looked up, his gaze meeting Caleb's, then the parson's. It wasn't medicine this time. It was rifles. A heavy silence filled the room. I took her money for the first ride, Elias continued, his voice barely a whisper. But I couldn't do the second. I couldn't be the man who armed those butchers. So I ran. I took the money. I bought my ranch. And I tried to disappear. I've been waiting for them to find me ever since. Mara reached out and placed her hand on his arm. A small gesture of solidarity. A good debt can't wash out a bad one, she said softly. Her words aimed at Elias but meant for all of them. But a man can choose again. Parson Reed nodded slowly. Indeed, he can. Redemption is not about erasing the past. Son, it's about building a better future. Caleb Rusk was more practical. All right, he said, his voice firm. We have a plan. It's risky, but it's a chance to cut the head off this snake for good. He looked from Elias to Mara, his respect for them clear in his eyes. Parson and I will round up a few good men we can trust. We'll be your shadows. We'll be ready. They spent another half hour refining the details. They took a white napkin from the parson's table, a stand-in for the lantern. If something goes wrong, Mara said, if the plan changes, I'll wave the lantern 3 times, like this. She demonstrated. A quick, sharp series of arcs. 3 waves means they're onto us. It means get out. It means run for needle wash. Elias took a piece of charcoal from the hearth and, on the smooth surface of the parson's oak table, he drew a crude map, a line for the river, a cross for the bridge, a square for the nickel star, a series of jagged lines for the narrow, winding canyon known as Needle Wash, the only viable escape route to the north. The black lines on the pale wood looked stark and final, a covenant drawn in ash. It was nearly dawn when they were finished. Parson Reed insisted Mara stay at the parsonage, offering her his daughter's small, neat room. She was too exhausted to argue. Elias walked with her to the door of the room, the hallway lit by a single, flickering candle. Be careful, he said, the words feeling small and inadequate for the world of fear they contained. You too, she whispered back. Before she lay down to try and get an hour or 2 of sleep, she saw her teaching satchel in the corner. She pulled out the small, leather-bound notebook she used for her lesson plans. She turned to a clean page and, with a piece of graphite, wrote a single line, a thought that had been forming in her mind all night, a new definition for an old word. To stay not a place, but a person. The nickel star was not as loud as it had been the night before. The nervous energy had curdled into something thicker, a watchful, waiting silence that clung to the smoky air like a shroud. The usual crowd of prospectors and ranch hands was thin, their instincts telling them that this was a night to be home, behind a locked door. Those who remained nursed their drinks with a grim quiet, their eyes darting toward the door, toward the windows, toward the 3 men who did not belong. Jax Murdoch stood near the front window, occasionally pulling back the grimy curtain to peer into the muddy street. Clive Rowe, his arm in a crude sling, sat at a table in the back, his good hand resting on the butt of his pistol. A third man, a stranger with a flattened nose and a vacant stare, leaned against the far wall, a sentinel guarding nothing. And at her usual table, Rosalind Pike waited. She was the calm at the center of the storm she had created, a queen on a shabby throne, a glass of whiskey untouched before her. She was watching the door. She was waiting for Elias. When the swinging doors pushed inward, it was not Elias who entered. It was Mara Lind. She stepped into the room, and a hush fell over the few remaining patrons. She was holding a lantern, a simple tin thing with clean glass panes, and the flame within burned with a steady, white light. It was not the smoky, yellow light of the saloon's lamps. It was clear, bright, and utterly out of place. She held it not as someone lighting their way, but as someone carrying a standard, a symbol. Rosalind's eyes narrowed. A slow, cold understanding dawned on her face. This was not the frightened schoolteacher from the ridge. This was a message. Elias was not coming to her broken. He was sending a declaration. Mara's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her face was a mask of serene purpose. She ignored the stares of the hollow spur men. She ignored the sudden, sharp tension that made the air feel thin and hard to breathe. Her gaze met Rosalind's across the room. A silent acknowledgement. Then she turned and walked to the bar, her steps even and measured. Outside, hidden in the deep shadows of the livery stable across the street, Caleb Rusk lowered his spyglass. "She's in," he whispered to the 3 stout-hearted townsmen crouched beside him. "Just like we planned. Hold until the signal." The bartender, a man named Silas with a perpetually worried expression, watched Mara approach as if she were a ghost. "Good evening, Silas," Mara said, her voice calm and clear, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "I won't be but a moment. I'm collecting donations for the school. We're in desperate need of new primers, and I thought I might appeal to the generosity of Juniper Ford's finest citizens." Her words were so jarringly normal, so absurdly out of place in the charged atmosphere, that for a moment, no one knew how to react. It was a masterful piece of misdirection. She placed her lantern carefully on the bar, its white light carving a clean circle in the smoky gloom. Then, from a canvas satchel, she pulled out a package. It was roughly the size of a book, wrapped in brown paper and tied securely with twine. She set it on the bar beside the lantern. "I've even brought the first donation myself," she announced to the silent room. "A book of poetry from my own collection. I'm hoping it will be the first of many." Jax Murdoch pushed himself away from the window and sauntered toward the bar, a cruel, mocking smile on his face. "Poetry ain't that sweet. The little schoolmarm's collecting books." He stopped beside her, leaning in, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "You think we're fools? Where is he?" "I'm sure I don't know who you mean," Mara replied, not flinching from his foul-smelling breath. "I'm merely trying to—" Jax's patience snapped. His hand shot out and grabbed the package. It felt wrong. Too light. He ripped at the paper. Inside was not a book, but a block of wood. The decoy. His face contorted in a mask of rage. "You little—" He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. "What is this? What's the game?" This was it, the moment. With her free hand, Mara reached for the lantern. With a flick of her thumb, she extinguished the flame, plunging their corner of the bar into shadow. The room held its breath. Then, just as quickly, she sparked the striker. The wick caught. The white flame bloomed once more. The signal! The back door of the saloon exploded inward, slamming against the wall with the force of a battering ram. Elias Thorne stood there, framed against the black, rainy night. He held a revolver in each hand. He didn't hesitate. He didn't aim at any man. He fired twice, the reports deafening in the enclosed space. The shots were aimed high, at the massive wooden beam that ran the length of the ceiling. 2 large splinters of wood erupted from the beam, and a shower of dust and debris rained down on the men below. A sudden, blinding storm. Chaos erupted. Jax, startled by the explosions from behind, momentarily loosened his grip on Mara. In that instant, Rosaline moved. She surged forward and grabbed Mara's other arm, pulling her away from Jax, closer to her own table. It was not a rescue. It was a reclaiming of a piece on the board. "I didn't want this," Rosaline hissed, her face inches from Mara's, her eyes wide with a strange, frantic light. For one fleeting second, the mask of control was gone, and Mara saw the real woman beneath a woman who had started a fire she could no longer contain. "To the bridge!" Caleb Rusk's voice boomed from the street as he and his men burst through the front doors. "They're at the bridge!" It was the second part of the diversion, meant to sow confusion, to make the Hollow Spur men think their prize was being stolen. Jax, believing the ruse, spun around and fired wildly toward the front door. A bullet screamed through the air and struck the banjo that had been hanging on the wall. A string snapped with a high, discordant twang, a sound like a dying scream. Men were shouting, diving for cover. The saloon became a whirlwind of smoke, noise, and fear. Caleb and his men were laying down covering fire, their shots aimed at the ceiling and the floor, pinning the outlaws down without seeking to kill. In the heart of the chaos, as Jax raised his pistol to fire again, Rosalind did the unthinkable, with a strength Mara would not have believed she possessed. Rosalind shoved the table over and yanked Mara down behind it, pulling her to the filthy, splintered floor. She threw her own body over Mara's, shielding her as wood chips and plaster rained down around them. It was not a calculated move. It was a raw, primal instinct. An act of protection so profound and unexpected it defied all logic. A new debt, heavier than any before it, was being created in the heart of the gunfire, paid not with money or loyalty, but with the shield of her own body. The plan had worked, better than they could have hoped. The entire force of the Hollow Spur gang was pinned down, their attention completely consumed by the firefight in the saloon. Elias, seeing his chance, slipped back out the rear door. Caleb Rusk, crouched behind an overturned card table, yelled over the din. "It was a trick. The package is at the bridge. That's where he's going." The realization struck Rosalind and Jax at the same moment. This entire bloody spectacle at the Nickel Star was nothing but a diversion, a grand piece of theater designed to draw them all into one place, while Elias went for the real prize. Rosalind pushed herself off Mara, her face a mask of fury and dawning horror. "The bridge!" she screamed at Jax. "Get to the bridge now!" The firefight ended as abruptly as it began. The outlaws, now desperate to save their treasure, scrambled for the exits, firing blindly behind them as they ran. They poured out into the dark, muddy street, their boots pounding in a frantic race against a man they had fatally underestimated. The saloon was left in a state of stunned, ringing silence. Smoke hung in the air, smelling of sulfur and burnt wood. The banjo hung crookedly on the wall, its string broken, and in the center of it all, Mara Lind slowly got to her feet, helped up by Caleb Rusk, her mind reeling not from the violence, but from the impossible, inexplicable act of the woman who had just saved her life. The fight for the Nickel Star was over. The battle for the wooden bridge was just beginning. The wooden bridge was no longer a bridge. It was a bridge of fire. Clive Rowe, his wounded arm held tight against his body, stood at the far end, holding a blazing pine knot torch. The flames danced and spat in the fine, persistent rain, casting a demonic, flickering light on the scene. The light glinted on the black, churning water of the Ash Willow River below, swollen and angry from the storm. In the center of the bridge, placed with a deliberate, arrogant finality, was a small, heavy-looking wooden crate bound with leather straps, the prize. Inside that crate was not gold, not guns, but something far more dangerous, a ledger book. Every dirty deal, every name, every blood-soaked dollar of the Hollow Spur gang's enterprise was meticulously recorded in its pages. It was Rosalind's chain, and it was Elias's death warrant. A sound cut through the roar of the river and the crackle of the flames, the frantic, desperate pounding of a horse's hooves on wet earth. It was not the familiar, powerful rhythm of Humbler. This was a smaller, wirier horse, a buckskin borrowed from the livery, its eyes wide with terror. Elias rode it not as a partner, but as a tool, a living projectile aimed at the heart of the fire. He didn't slow as he reached the near end of the bridge. He rose in the stirrups and launched himself from the saddle. a dark, fluid shape, arcing through the firelight. He hit the damp planks, tucked his shoulder, and rolled, coming to his feet with a long-bladed skinning knife already in his hand. The borrowed horse, freed of its burden, shied violently and galloped back into the darkness. Clive shouted a warning, raising his pistol, but Elias was a blur of motion. He was not the quiet rancher now. He was the man from the high country, the man who had survived a blizzard and the men who had hunted him. He lunged forward and slashed the leather straps holding the crate to the bridge planks. One cut, two. The crate was free, hidden in the deep, wet shadows of a massive support piling on the near bank. Mara watched, her heart a wild bird trapped in her ribs. She had run from the saloon, her lungs burning, her feet slipping in the thick mud, driven by a force she didn't understand. She only knew she had to be here. She had to see it through. Now, seeing Elias, so alone and exposed against the flames, a terrible, cold fear washed over her. Then she heard more horses. From the town side, the direction she had just come. Jax Murdoch, Rosalind, and the third outlaw thundered into the clearing, their faces demonic masks in the shifting, hellish light. They reined in hard, seeing the scene before them on Clive wounded, Elias with his hand on the prize. "Thorn!" Jax bellowed, swinging down from his horse, his revolver already in his hand. "I knew you didn't have the stomach to run. You should have taken the deal." "The deal's off, Jax," Elias said, his voice dangerously calm. He didn't move from his position beside the crate. He was balanced on the balls of his feet, a predator ready to spring. The standoff was absolute. Elias was trapped on the bridge, the outlaws blocking one end, the river churning below, on the bank, not 30 feet from Elias but hidden in the darkness. Caleb Rusk and his men lay waiting, rifles ready. The plan had been for Elias to get the package and retreat, leading the gang into their trap. But now, with the fire spreading, with the outlaws between him and safety, the plan was falling apart. Mara pressed herself against the cold, wet wood of the piling. She could feel the vibrations of the fire through the timber. She saw Elias's eyes flicker for a half-second toward the bank, toward the spot where he knew Caleb was waiting. He needed an opening, a distraction, something to break the deadlock. It was her turn. She took a deep, shuddering breath, filling her lungs with the smoky, damp air. She gathered all of her fear, all of her resolve, and gave it a voice. 3 waves. Her voice, high and clear, sliced through the noise of the fire and the river. It was not a scream of terror. It was a command, a signal. For a heartbeat, everyone froze. Jax's head snapped in her direction, his eyes searching the shadows, confused. But Elias understood. It was the code. Change the plan. Change the target. Now. He didn't hesitate. Instead of trying to run back toward the town, he bent his knees, grabbed the heavy crate, and with a grunt of raw effort, heaved it not forward, not backward, but sideways. The crate flew through the air, end over end, a dark projectile against the flames, and landed with a heavy, sodden thud in the mud of the riverbank, just feet from where Caleb Rusk lay hidden. "No!" Jax roared, realizing in an instant he'd been tricked. He spun, his gun coming up, but his rage was not for Elias. It was for the voice that had undone him. He fired blindly into the shadows where Mara was hidden. The shot went wide, but the bullet slammed into the wooden piling inches from Mara's head. The wood exploded, a shower of sharp, stinging splinters. One of them, long and cruel as a needle, sliced across her cheek, and she cried out, a sharp gasp of pain and shock. She felt a warm trickle of blood trace a path down her face. Elias saw the flash of the gun, heard her cry. The world went silent for him. There was no more plan, no more ledger. There was only Mara. In 2 long strides, he was in front of the piling, his body a shield, his back to the man who was trying to kill her. He stood there, unarmed, exposed, waiting for the second shot. But it didn't come. "Enough, Jax!" Rosalind's voice was sharp, cracking like a whip. She had drawn a small, silver-plated derringer from her coat and was pointing it at Jax, her hand steady, her aim low. "We have gone too far." Her face, illuminated by the growing fire, was a landscape of horror. She was looking at Jax, at his snarling, unrestrained brutality, and seeing the reflection of her own choices. She had unleashed this, and she was finally seeing the true face of the beast she had fed. "Get out of my way, Rosaline," Jax snarled, shoving her aside with his free arm. "She's the cause of this." He raised his pistol again, aiming it past Elias directly at Mara's face, which was now pale and blood-streaked in the firelight. The river seemed to gasp, the water churning beneath the straining timbers of the bridge. Before he could pull the trigger, Elias exploded into motion. He launched himself at Jax, a silent, vengeful force. It was not a fight, it was an impact. They went down in a tangle of limbs, grappling, punching, their grunts of effort lost in the roar of the flames. They rolled across the slick, wet planks, two dark figures locked in a mortal struggle, tumbling directly into the line of fire that was now creeping across the width of the bridge. That was the signal for Caleb. "Now!" he yelled. He and his men burst from the trees, their rifles leveled. Clive Rowe, still stunned, barely had time to raise his good hand in surrender before he was seized and disarmed. The bridge groaned, a deep, terrible sound of wood and iron surrendering to fire and weight. The main support beam on the far side began to splinter. Rosaline, scrambling to her feet, saw it. The entire structure was about to go. She looked at Elias and Jax, still locked together, silhouetted against the flames. Then she looked at Mara, who was staggering out from behind the piling, one hand pressed to her bleeding cheek, her eyes wide with shock. Rosaline made her final choice. She ran to Mara, grabbed her arm, and dragged her bodily away from the bridge entrance, pulling her back onto the solid, safe ground of the riverbank. She gave her one last, desperate push, sending her stumbling into the arms of a waiting townsman. It was a repayment, a final, desperate act of redemption. With a sound like the world cracking in two, the wooden bridge gave way. The timbers screamed as they tore apart, and the entire structure sagged, buckled, and then plunged into the black, churning water below. A great cloud of steam and hissing smoke erupted as fire met water. Elias felt the world drop out from under him. He broke his hold on Jax, scrabbling for purchase on the tilting planks. Jax, his eyes wide with terror, was not so lucky. He gave a final, choked cry as he was thrown into the torrent, a brief, pale shape that was immediately swallowed by the river's cold, dark fury. The fire was extinguished, leaving only the memory of its heat and the thick, acrid smell of charred, wet wood. The climax was over. The night was suddenly, profoundly silent, save for the rush of the river and the soft, steady weeping of the rain. Juniper Ford awoke to a world washed clean. The dawn broke clear and cool, the sky a pale, fragile blue that promised a day of quiet and sun. The air smelled of damp earth, of rain-soaked sage, and, carried on the faintest of breezes, the distant, sharp scent of burnt, wet wood from the river. It was the smell of a fever that had broken, a storm that had passed. The town took a collective, shuddering breath and began the slow, steady work of putting itself back together. The first official act of the new day was performed by Deputy Caleb Rusk. He walked out of the small building that served as the town's courthouse and jail, carrying a hammer and the town's sign. The sign was a simple plank of wood, with one word painted on it in stark black letters, L-Law. He carefully hung it back on its hooks by the door, making sure it was straight and true. It was a small act, but it was a declaration. The chaos was over. Order had been restored. Inside, on the surface of his plain pine desk, lay a thick, leather-bound ledger. its pages filled with the spidery script of Rosalind Pike's dark enterprise. It was a closed book now, its secrets exposed to the light. An hour later, as the sun began to warm the muddy streets, another, quieter departure took place. A rickety buckboard wagon, pulled by a tired-looking mule, rattled its way out of town, heading east, away from the mountains. At the reins sat Rosalind Pike. She was dressed in a plain, dark traveling dress, her vibrant auburn hair hidden beneath a drab bonnet. She looked smaller, diminished, a queen stripped of her kingdom. She did not look back. No one came to see her off. Her departure was as silent and unnoticed as a shadow slipping away at sunrise. She had left one thing behind. On the counter of the mercantile, she had placed a small, velvet pouch for Mrs. Gable to deliver to the schoolteacher. Inside, coiled like a pale, sleeping snake, was the string of pearls. Tucked alongside them was a folded piece of paper. The note was brief, the handwriting surprisingly elegant. It read, "To replace a book given in bad faith, may this buy something clean." That morning, in the small, sun-drenched schoolhouse, Mara Lynn's students were practicing their letters. The air was filled with the familiar, comforting smells of chalk dust and old paper. The small, jagged cut on Mara's cheek was covered with a neat plaster, a tiny, pale scar that would serve as a permanent reminder of the night the world had caught fire. She had asked the children to write a word that made them feel safe. Samuel and Peter had written, "Mama," "Little Nellie Hart," her ordeal at the creek already fading into the resilient past of childhood, had written, "Bed." Then, one of the older boys, inspired by the stories that were already turning into legend around the town, carefully, painstakingly, wrote a single four-letter word on the blackboard. "Stay." The other children, liking the sound and shape of it, copied him. Soon, the entire blackboard was covered in the word, written in the clumsy, earnest script of the young. Mara watched them, a lump forming in her throat. As one of the boys wiped the board clean with a felt eraser, a cloud of white chalk dust billowed into a sunbeam, falling through the air as gently and as silently as the first winter snow. A clean slate, a new beginning. She did not go to Dry Cedar Ridge that afternoon. She waited until the next day, until the raw, ragged edges of the previous night had had time to soften. She packed a basket with a fresh loaf of bread, still warm from Mrs. Gable's oven, a small crock of butter, and a jar of apple preserves. She borrowed the same placid mule and rode the familiar trail up into the hills. The land itself seemed calmer, the sky bigger, the silence less a thing of loneliness and more a thing of peace. When she arrived, she saw him. He was out by the far fence line, in the exact spot where the hollow spur's brand had scarred his property. The burned post was gone, lying on a heap of dead wood, ready to be split for the hearth. In its place, Elias was setting a new post, a clean, pale length of cedar that smelled sharply of sap. He worked with the same steady, focused rhythm as before, digging the hole, tamping the earth, his movements a kind of prayer offered to the land. She dismounted and tied the mule to the hitching post, but this time, she didn't wait on the porch. She walked directly out to the fence line, her basket swinging in her hand, her boots making soft impressions in the damp, dark earth. He heard her coming but didn't stop his work until she was standing just a few feet away. He straightened up, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He looked tired, the skin around his eyes bruised with exhaustion, but the haunted, hunted look was gone. In its place was a deep, quiet stillness. "I brought bread," she said, her voice a little breathless from the walk. He looked at the basket, then at her face, his gaze lingering for a moment on the small plaster on her cheek. He nodded. "Thank you." She set the basket down on a flat-topped rock, and they stood there for a moment in a comfortable, shared silence. The only sounds the whisper of the wind through the grass and the distant cry of a hawk circling in the vast blue overhead. He finished his work, his movements sure and final as he drove the last staple into the new post. The fence was whole again. His world was secure. He picked up his tools and turned to walk back to the cabin. Mara fell into step beside him. They didn't speak. There was no need. The great, violent storm had passed through them, and in its wake, it had scoured away all the old defenses, all the fear and mistrust, leaving only a quiet, simple truth. They reached the porch steps, the same steps where they had first shared a meal, the same steps where she had taught his neighbor's children. He sat down on the top step, weariness settling into his bones. He leaned back against the rough log wall of the cabin and closed his eyes, tilting his face up to the warmth of the afternoon sun. Mara remained standing, the basket in her hand, the moment stretching between them, soft and full of unspoken words. She thought of her small room at the boarding house, of the lonely quiet that awaited her there. Then she looked at him, at this solitary man on his solitary ridge, and she knew, with an absolute certainty that settled deep in her soul, that she was already home. He opened his eyes and looked up at her. His voice, when he spoke, was as soft and gentle as a breath of wind, carrying none of its old, rough edges. The question from before, once born of desperation and fear, was now offered as a quiet, hopeful invitation. "Will you stay after?" A slow smile spread across her face, a smile that reached her eyes and filled them with a warm, brilliant light. The final wall inside her heart crumbled, turning to dust in the afternoon sun. "If you'll save me a seat on this porch," she answered, her voice just as quiet, just as sure. "Every sunset." He did not smile, but the stillness in his face softened, the deep lines around his eyes easing. He shifted slightly, making a space for her on the step beside him. As she sat down, setting the basket between them, her hand brushed against his fingers, calloused and strong from his work, closed gently around hers. It was not a passionate grasp, not a promise of forever. It was a simple, profound acknowledgement, a silent agreement, a place to rest, a place for fear and loneliness, and the ghosts of the past to finally, quietly, go to sleep. High above them, a pair of hawks rode the thermal currents, their wings spread wide as they drew lazy, effortless circles in the endless sky. The wind moved through the new green grass that was already pushing its way up through the damp earth. A sound like a long, contented sigh. To stay was no longer a question or a place. It had become a verb for two. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help share it with even more listeners.